Hi everyone. In this video I'm going to be introducing you to the lymphoid system. And I reckon that the lymphoid system is probably one of the most underrated systems in the body. It is very important because without it we would essentially not have enough blood volume to allow us to operate at a homeostatic level every day. It is not only important in returning fluid back to the heart and cardiovascular system to ensure that blood is flowing through the system effectively, but it also allows for appropriate immune responses because the lymphoid system is actually where the majority of immune cells are present within the body. So what is the lymphoid system? We'll first define it. The lymphoid system is quite a complex system, and it's made up of different lymphatic tissues, and all of these tissues have the role of defending the body against infection and disease. So the first primary role of the lymphoid system is to act as a defense system or defend the body against infection. Alright, and so that makes sense because, as I mentioned earlier, the lymphoid system is the system within the body that contains the majority or a high amount of immune cells. And that subsequently means that it's easily able to sense various pathogens which may be present within the body, to therefore mean that an immune response can be incited. So the way in which the lymphoid system actually does this is that it drains fluid, extracellular tissue fluid, monitors it, and then removes any foreign material and fights infection. So let's break that down. So firstly, the lymphoid system contains various structures called lymphoid plexuses, and these lymphoid plexuses are responsible for draining extracellular fluid from tissues. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you know anything about the hemodynamics of blood in a capillary, you'll know, and I'll quickly just go through it here. Say if this is a capillary, and we have red blood cells, maybe some leukocytes, platelets, various waste products, and other plasma proteins, then whenever a capillary flows into a tissue, there is obviously going to be the flow of blood plasma out of that capillary because blood is pushing against the walls of that capillary. This is what blood pressure is. And since it pushes against that capillary wall, it allows for some plasma to flow out, and the pressure that pushes against that capillary wall is referred to as the hydrostatic pressure. So now we've established that the hydrostatic pressure exists. Well, good. So the thing that happens next is that since this blood plasma has been lost to the external environment, there has to be some way that some can be recuperated. And that's where the plasma proteins, which are these little guys that I drew in before, come into play. These plasma proteins are special in that, as with any protein, they're able to allow for water to be grabbed from the tissues and back into the cells. And this ability, or this force that grabs water from the tissues and back into the cells, is called the colloid osmotic pressure. Now, the colloid osmotic pressure, as its name suggests, is due to the colloid, or the plasma proteins, and it tries to recuperate as much fluid or blood plasma that has been lost to the tissues as possible. Now, unfortunately, there is a slight discrepancy between the hydrostatic and colloid osmotic pressure, in that in a day, usually if 30 liters of blood blood plasma within a day is lost to the extracellular tissues, only 27 liters is returned back to the cardiovascular system. So what happens with the other 3 liters? Well, essentially, that is what the lymphoid system is responsible for. So as you can see, it is quite important because imagine you're losing 3 liters of fluid in tissues every day. That will cause you extreme edema. So the lymphoid system is quite important to drain that excess extracellular fluid from tissues. And since it is responsible for this drainage, and if you want, pause this video, take a screenshot of the hydrostatic pressure diagram because I'm about to rub it out. What it does when it takes up that fluid is that it allows for the monitoring of that fluid. And what that essentially means is that since it contains all of those leukocytes, as the lymphoid system contains a greater concentration of leukocytes as opposed to the bloodstream, it monitors that fluid, filters it, removes any foreign or possibly harmful materials, and then allows for the fighting of infections. And this is where we move on to the 3 functions of the lymphoid system. And the way in which I like to remember the 3 functions of the lymphoid system is remembering the abbreviation FIT. So functions of the lymphoid system. And there are 3 functions, and I like to remember them using FIT. So first one, F, it's responsible for fluid balance. So fluid balance means that the lymphatic capillaries that are present in tissues absorb the interstitial fluid and return it to the cardiovascular system, ensuring that there is balance between what fluid is lost and what fluid is gained back. The I in FIT stands for immunity. So as I mentioned before, since the lymphatic system contains a great amount of immune cells, it has control over both the adaptive and innate immunity to allow for an immune response to occur if some foreign object, maybe a toxin or a microbe, enters the lymphatic system. And finally, the T in the function of the immune system, lymphoid system, stands for transport. And the lymphatic system is responsible for the transportation of lipids that cannot pass through the wall of the small intestine and dumps them into the thoracic duct. And this may not be something that you have heard of. If you have done some gastrointestinal physiology, you may have learnt about it. But basically in the stomach, our body itself directly absorbs nutrients and water into the bloodstream, and this blood from the stomach flows directly, or from the small intestine I should say, flows directly into the liver to be processed. But the thing with fats is that fat molecules are too large, and usually because of their hydrophobic nature, they're unable to pass through the channels anyway. So what happens is that in the small intestine we have special essentially blind-ended channels which are part of the lymphatic system called lacteals, and these channels are responsible for the absorption of these fats. And essentially, since the lymphatic system is separate to the cardiovascular system, the fats are taken in through the lacteals, transported through and back into what we call the thoracic duct, which is one of the largest lymphatic vessels in the body. So when it flows into the lymphatic duct, it then is able to drain directly pretty much into the right atrium. And that is how fats move from the small intestine to the cardiovascular system. They don't move directly into it by diffusing through the enterocytes as do other nutrients, but rather they flow first through the entire lymphatic system pretty much, and then into the cardiovascular system through the heart, by which they can either be transported to the liver, or if they've encountered any lipoproteins in the process, then they can be transported directly to the tissues. So now that we've explored the functions and what the lymphatic system actually is, I want to talk about a few features of the lymphatic system. Essentially, when we think about the lymphatic system, there are many ways in which lymph fluid can actually pass through the body. And that's because, unlike the liberties of the cardiovascular system, which has the heart to pump blood around the body, the lymphatic system itself, although it is a system in the body that transports fluid, it does not have a pumping organ as such, like the heart. So how does fluid in the lymphatic system actually move around the body? Well, there are three main ways in which lymphatic fluid is able to flow through the body. The first way is through skeletal muscle contraction. So, like veins, lymphatic vessels are able to allow for their fluid to be pushed along these vessels by the contraction of skeletal muscles. And if you think about it, if a lymphatic vessel is present between, let's say, for example, the two heads of a muscle, such as the gastrocnemius, when the gastrocnemius contracts, it is able to allow for the contraction of that lymphatic vessel as well, which pushes fluid. The second way by which lymphatic fluid is able to flow throughout the body is through respiratory changes in pressure. And what that means is that as one breathes, basically what happens is that when you breathe in and you think about your chest, it moves upwards and outwards, right? So that movement is increasing the volume within your thoracic cavity because your lungs are expanding and the size of that cavity is getting larger. So if you know anything about the movement of fluids due to pressure, whenever the pressure in a certain area of the body decreases, the flow of blood in that area will increase because blood always moves from places of higher to lower pressure. And the same is present with lymphatic fluid. When someone breathes in and breathes out, lymphatic fluid moves at a faster and slower rate as well. That's because when you breathe out, your thoracic cavity moves down and in, and the thoracic volume becomes smaller, and it becomes smaller, and that means that lymphatic fluid is able to move at a slower rate because it has less ability to move from a higher to low pressure environment. So respiratory changes in pressure also define the movement of lymphatic fluid. And the final aspect that allows for the movement of lymphatic fluid is actually the same as what allows for the movement of blood throughout the veins. And this mechanism is through lymphatic valves. Oops, I just realized I spelled that wrong. So lymphatic valves. So lymphatic valves are essentially endothelium flaps that are present within the lymphatic vessels that allow for both movement of the fluid through the vessel, and they ensure, similar to veins, that the movement of fluid through that vessel is occurring in one direction only. Alright, so now that we've explored the three main ways in which fluid moves through a lymphatic vessel, I also want to talk about some of the structural aspects of lymphatic vessels. So, as I mentioned before, lymphatic vessels are present within the tissues of the body because this is where they collect the fluid. And the part of the lymphatic circulation where the actual vessels are present within the tissues is called a lymphatic plexus. So say, for example, if we just draw a line here and we say this is a tissue with its various cells, just draw some cells roughly. So these are the cells that make up the tissue, and they have the nuclei. What lymphatic plexuses do is that they wrap essentially between these cells and allow for the clearing of fluid. So say if that blue line is an example, and I'll just shade it in so that it's a bit more clear. Say that blue line is a lymphatic vessel. A key feature of lymphatic vessels is that they are blind-ended, which means that they just end in a particular part of the body. They don't necessarily have to be connected to anything. They can be like a street that ends on a court, which is where the street simply just ends and there's a roundabout maybe at the end. That's what basically happens. The fluid flows in and it goes around and enters back out of the vessel. So lymphatic vessels, firstly, are blind-ended. And they have a very special feature that allows them to increase the flow into that particular lymphatic vessel whenever the pressure on that tissue increases as well. And the special feature is called an anchor filament. So anchor filaments are basically elastic fibers that are present on groups of cells that are present around the lymphatic vessel. So say, for example, we take some of these cells on the peripheries of that vessel. Say if this, let me change to a different color. Say if this vessel has an anchor filament that connects there. This cell has an anchor filament that connects there. This cell that has an anchor filament that connects there. And this cell has an anchor filament that connects there. And these anchor filaments are essentially bound to the endothelial cells, which form the border or the wall of the lymphatic vessel. So these elastic fibers extend out from either side of the lymphatic vessel and hold it in place within the surrounding interstitial cells. So when the tissue becomes swollen, or if there's an increase in the amount of fluid within that tissue, then the anchoring proteins, so these proteins that are present on the base of the anchoring filaments, pull on the filaments, such that the endothelial cells open out. So now the cell will be opened that way, and since they open outwards, they allow for a greater flow of tissue fluid into the vessel. So when the tissue becomes swollen, the anchoring proteins pull on the endothelial cells and open the pores even further to allow for fluid drainage. And that's a pretty smart system. The body has adapted in a way such that if it encounters an area of swollen tissue, then it is able to allow for a change or an adaptation in that tissue to mean that there is an essentially there is increased clearing of lymph fluid from that particular tissue. And that is what I want to talk about next. This is the concept of lymph. And lymph is the fluid that flows throughout the lymphatic system, such as blood flows through the cardiovascular system. Now, lymph is the fluid component, as I mentioned, of the lymphoid system. And a key thing to remember, if we talk about lymph here, is that it is clear and watery. When we explore the composition of lymph fluid, we see that it does have a composition that is like blood. However, it contains lymphocytes and macrophages at a higher concentration than blood. So leukocytes in general, and specifically lymphocytes and macrophages, are increased compared to blood. And that makes sense because the lymphatic system is where these leukocytes actually mature, and it is where they usually incite a particular immune response as well, because when a microbe enters the lymphatic system, it is able to allow for an activation of that particular leukocyte to ensure that that microbe is taken care of and essentially cleared from the body. So once again, reviewing what we've talked about so far, lymphatic vessels can allow for the movement of fluid through three main mechanisms: skeletal muscle, respiratory changes in pressure, and lymphatic valves. The lymphatic plexuses are capillaries that are the smallest vessels of the system. They are blind-ended and begin in the extracellular space of the tissue. And of course, once again, the lymph is propelled through these vessels by valves, and they contain anchor filaments, which are able to allow for the movement of an excess amount of tissue fluid, such as edematous fluid, into the lymphatic capillary from the tissue, by allowing for the opening of the endothelial cells that line the lymphatic vessels to a greater extent. And finally, the lymph itself is a clear and watery solution that is made up of more leukocytes compared to blood. The final two concepts that I want to talk about are the main aspects that form the lymphatic system, and these are the lymph vessels and lymph organs. So the lymph vessels, as I've talked about previously, are a network of thin-walled vessels originating from the lymphatic plexuses. So these lymphatic vessels, a key feature to remember is that they are usually just a endothelially lined vessel, and they have a very rudimentary basement membrane. And rudimentary basically means that it's not clear and it's not constant. So as you can see, these cells are not, these lymphatic vessels are not very strong, and the cells are not joined together or forming a coherent wall in a very strong extent. So these vessels are what return the excess interstitial fluid to the venous system. Lymphoid organs, on the other hand, are organs that are present throughout the body, where firstly lymphocytes can be made and mature, and these sites also modulate the lymph fluids composition. So some examples of lymphoid organs include the thymus, which is where T lymphocytes mature, the lymph nodes, and the lymph nodes are pretty much the key functional aspect of the lymphatic system. They are essentially small oval masses of lymphatic tissue. They are found pretty much all around the body along lymphatic vessels, and they filter lymph as it makes its way through the venous system. There are hundreds and hundreds of nodes on the body, and they're distributed in areas that are susceptible to injury or invasion. And the reason for this can be both positive and negative. Firstly, it's good that lymph nodes are present in areas where we see injuries quite a lot, because that's where the areas where you need the most amount of leukocytes to incite an immune response. But at the same time, if we get an injury in that area, then it is likely that that microbe is likely to spread through that lymphatic vessel to the cardiovascular system and possibly infiltrate the blood vessels. Furthermore, since that lymphatic network is so connected to tissues, cancer cells are easily able to move from tissues into lymphatic vessels because these vessels drain lymphatic fluid, and cancer cells can flow into those vessels when this drainage process occurs. Other examples include of lymphatic organs include the spleen, the tonsils, and what are usually referred to as inflamed tonsils, adenoids. So, quickly reviewing what we talked about today, we talked about firstly the functions and the actual processes that occur within the lymphatic system. We explored the three different ways in which lymph flows through the system, what is lymph, how anchor filaments assist lymph movement, and finally we took a very quick look at lymph vessels and organs, especially looking at lymph nodes and how their placement can be both advantageous and disadvantageous. So I hope what I've talked about today has made sense, and thank you very much for watching.